It is March 2009. Southeast London, England. A Metropolitan Police surveillance team has been watching a grey Mitsubishi Shogun for several nights. They know who owns it. They know where he lives. They know his name. What they do not yet have is the one thing that will make the case unassailable in court. They need to catch him at a scene. The operation has been running, in various forms, for 17 years. The first reported offence dates to October 1992. By 2009, investigators believe the same individual is responsible for over 100 attacks, predominantly on elderly residents, asleep in their own homes, in the quiet residential streets of southeast and southwest London. The offender has been profiled, sketched, given a name by the press, the Night Stalker. He has never been arrested. He has never been formally identified. And on this particular night in March 2009, the surveillance team watches him walk toward a house and has to decide about when to move. 3 questions define Operation Minstead. How did a single offender commit over 100 documented crimes in one of the world's most surveilled cities without being caught for 17 years? What went wrong in the investigation, and when? And how did the team that finally trapped him actually do it? This is a story about forensic persistence, institutional failure, and the gap between collecting evidence and knowing what to do with it. If global true crime told with this level of analytical rigor is what you're after, consider subscribing to Enter the Crime. But to understand how March 2009 arrived, we have to go back to where it started. A terrified resident, an open window, and a crime scene that yielded more than anyone initially realized. London is the capital of England and one of the largest cities in Europe, home to approximately 8 million people. Southeast London, the area south of the River Thames covering boroughs such as Bromley, Lewisham, Greenwich, and Croydon, is a sprawling mix of Victorian terraced housing, post-war estates, and quiet suburban streets. In the 1990s and 2000s it was, and remains, one of the most diverse urban areas in the world. On screen, map of Greater London with southeast and southwest boroughs highlighted. In 1992, London was recovering from a deep economic recession. Unemployment was high. Public services were under pressure. The Metropolitan Police, the police force responsible for most of Greater London, known colloquially as the Met, was an institution navigating serious internal tensions. In 1993, the murder of black teenager Stephen Lawrence in southeast London and the subsequent botched investigation would trigger the most significant public examination of the Met in its history, culminating in a 1999 public inquiry that found the force institutionally racist. That context, a police force under scrutiny, in a community with fractured trust, is the backdrop against which Operation Minstead would unfold. The victims of the series of offenses that would become Operation Minstead share a demographic profile. They were predominantly elderly, many in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, and a significant majority were black residents of Caribbean heritage who had come to Britain during the Windrush generation of the 1950s and 1960s, building lives and families and growing old in the communities they had helped shape. Because this documentary respects victim privacy and the wishes of families who have not sought public attention, individual victims are not named here beyond what has been established in open court proceedings and public reporting. What the documented record makes clear is this: these were people in the most vulnerable phase of life, in what should have been the safety of their own homes. Many lived alone. Several were in poor health. Some had dementia. The offenders selected them precisely because of those vulnerabilities. The long-term psychological impact of the crimes extended beyond individual victims. Residents across the affected communities, many of them elderly and many of them living alone, became afraid to sleep in their own homes. Some barricaded doors. Some moved. The fear generated by a single individual operating over 17 years reshaped the daily lives of an entire community. From the earliest offenses, investigators were working with an unusual forensic situation. The offender left DNA at scenes. In an era before the UK National DNA Database was comprehensive, this was less immediately useful than it sounds, but it meant that from early in the investigation, there existed a biological profile of the person responsible. The question was finding a match. Eyewitness descriptions, composite sketches, and the analysis of offense patterns built up a picture over years. A black male, believed to be between 40 and 60, operating primarily at night, gaining entry through unlocked or poorly secured ground floor windows, and demonstrating a consistency of method across scenes that pointed unambiguously to a single individual. He was methodical. He was patient. And for 17 years, he was invisible to the investigation in the most important sense. Despite being in the DNA database searches, despite the surveillance, despite the suspect lists, he was not there. Or so investigators believed. The reason he was not found sooner is one of the most instructive and uncomfortable stories in British forensic history. And it begins with a database, a sample, and a mistake that cost years. The offences that formed the core of Operation Minstead followed a consistent and documented pattern across more than 100 reported incidents spanning 17 years. Understanding the method is essential to understanding both why it was difficult to stop and why the forensic evidence, ultimately, became so powerful. The offender operated at night, typically in the early hours of the morning. He targeted ground floor entry points, windows left slightly open for ventilation, inadequately secured back doors, accessible garden-facing entry points. The homes he selected were almost always occupied by elderly residents sleeping. He moved quietly and deliberately. The crimes themselves, which the court record describes as serious sexual offenses committed against sleeping or semi-conscious elderly victims, were not accompanied by significant violence. There was no confrontation in the sense of physical assault. Victims woke to find him present or discovered evidence of his presence after he had left. In some cases, they were not aware anything had happened until a welfare check or medical appointment revealed it. That clinical description does not capture the human reality. These were profound violations of safety, bodily autonomy, and dignity committed against people who were among the most vulnerable members of society. The absence of physical violence did not reduce the trauma. In many documented cases, it deepened because victims were left to piece together what had happened, alone, in the home they had lived in for decades. The first offence linked to the series occurred in October 1992 in Shirley, in the London borough of Croydon. Over the following 17 years, the geographical range expanded across southeast and southwest London, Bromley, Lewisham, Greenwich, Lambeth, Wandsworth. The Metropolitan Police's Operation Minstead team, formally constituted in the late 1990s, eventually identified over 100 offences they believed were connected. Some researchers and victim advocates believe the true number is higher. The pattern showed no significant changes in method over time. The offender did not escalate to physical violence. He did not change his entry techniques substantially. He did not appear to be deterred by increased police presence in particular areas. He simply moved to adjacent streets or neighboring boroughs and continued. This consistency is forensically significant. It means the DNA evidence from early scenes and the DNA evidence from later scenes all pointed to the same individual, building, sample by sample, a case that needed only a match to become conclusive. The investigation had the evidence. It did not have the name to attach to it. Not yet. The question of why it took so long is not primarily about the offender's skill. It is about a series of investigative and administrative decisions, some understandable given the technology of the time, others harder to defend, that together added up to 17 years. The United Kingdom established the National DNA Database, known as NDNAD, in 1995. It was the first national DNA database in the world. By the 2000s, it had become one of the most powerful forensic tools available to British police, containing DNA profiles from individuals arrested or convicted of crimes, and allowing investigators to run crime scene samples against the database to identify matches. Operation Minstead had DNA from crime scenes dating back to the early 1990s. When the database was established, those samples were run against it. No match. This is the starting point of the investigative failure. Delroy Grant, the man who would eventually be arrested and convicted, had a criminal record in the United Kingdom. He had previous convictions. Under the rules governing database inclusion at various points in the investigation's history, his DNA profile should have been on the National DNA Database. There are documented questions about why it was not, questions that the post-conviction review of Operation Minstead examined carefully. The short version: at some point in the administrative chain between Grant's previous contact with the justice system and the database searches being run by Operation Minstead, his profile was either not loaded, not retained, or not matched in the way it should have been. The precise administrative failure has been acknowledged by the Metropolitan Police. The consequences of that failure were measured in years and in victims. Early in Operation Minstead's formal existence, investigators developed a detailed offender profile based on witness descriptions, geographic analysis of the offenses, and behavioral assessment. The profile pointed toward a man likely in his 40s or 50s, of African-Caribbean heritage, probably local to the areas of offending, possibly known to at least some victims or their communities. The profile was, in broad terms, accurate. But profiles are frameworks, not identifications. And in the early 2000s, Operation Minstead pursued several individuals who fitted the general profile sufficiently to warrant investigation, men who lived in the right areas, who had relevant criminal histories, who matched elements of the witness descriptions. None of them was Grant. Each investigation that went somewhere other than Grant was time, resource, and investigative momentum directed away from him. The team was not incompetent. They were working with genuine uncertainty and a profile that described a category rather than a person. But each wrong turn extended the timeline. By the mid-2000s, Operation Minstead had become one of the Metropolitan Police's largest and longest-running unsolved series. The pressure, from victims, from community groups, from media, from within the force, to produce an arrest was significant. The decision was made to conduct a mass DNA screening, approaching large numbers of men in the affected communities who fitted the offender profile and asking them to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. Mass voluntary DNA screenings are a legitimate and sometimes effective investigative tool. They had been used successfully in several British cases, including the 1986 Colin Pitchfork case in Leicestershire, the first case in the world in which DNA evidence was used to convict a murderer. The logic is straightforward. If the offender is among the population being screened, and if they comply, they will be identified. Operation Minstead's mass screening involved thousands of men. It was a significant logistical operation, requiring the management of a vast amount of data, the coordination of community liaison, and the careful handling of what was, necessarily, an intrusive process for the men approached. Many cooperated willingly, understanding the purpose. Grant was not among those screened. He was not identified as falling within the target population for that particular exercise. He remained, from the investigation's perspective, not yet in the picture. By 2008 and into 2009, Operation Minstead had developed enough intelligence to identify a small number of high-priority individuals worthy of active surveillance. Delroy Grant was among them, not yet confirmed as the offender, but sufficiently identified through a combination of intelligence sources, geographic analysis, and investigative work to justify watching. The surveillance operation was resource-intensive. Teams rotated. The target moved between addresses. There were nights when the surveillance lost him. There were periods when resources were stretched and coverage was reduced. On the night of November 14, 2009, after months of surveillance, the team was in position. Grant was observed approaching and entering a property in Croydon. Officers moved in. He was arrested at the scene. When his DNA was taken at arrest and run against the crime scene database, MASH. Conclusive. Immediate. The profile that had been in the investigation's evidence files for years, the DNA from scenes going back to the early 1990s, matched the man now sitting in a police custody suite. 17 years. Over 100 offenses. And the answer had been in the database the entire time. Here is the question that the Operation Minstead review confronted directly. If the DNA database match had been made correctly in the first instance, if Grant's profile had been properly loaded and searched, how many of those 100-plus offenses would never have happened? Think about that before the next section. The arrest was the beginning of the legal process. But the investigators who built the case from that point forward knew that the arrest, while necessary, was also an indictment of a system that had held the answer and not known it. Delroy Grant was born in Jamaica in 1957 and came to the United Kingdom as a child. At the time of his arrest in 2009, he was 52 years old, living in Brockley, southeast London. He was employed as a carer, working with elderly and vulnerable adults. He was married. He attended church. He was, to the people around him, a quiet and unremarkable presence. The documented contrast between his public life and the offenses for which he was convicted is stark and has been noted by investigators, journalists, and criminologists who have written about the case. He worked caring for elderly people during the day. He attacked elderly people at night. He was trusted by vulnerable adults in a professional capacity while exploiting the vulnerability of others in a criminal one. Beyond that documented contrast, this documentary will not speculate about motivation or psychological profile. The court heard extensive evidence. Grant himself, through his legal representation, maintained that his convictions were wrong, a position he continued to hold after sentencing. The jury disagreed. The detectives and staff who worked Operation Minstead over its 17-year span did so under considerable pressure and with genuine commitment to finding the person responsible. Several have spoken publicly about the emotional toll of working a case in which the evidence was compelling, the victims were real and ongoing, and the identification remained just out of reach. The case became, within the Metropolitan Police, something of an institutional weight, a case that defined careers, that absorbed resources, that represented an open wound in the force's relationship with the communities most affected. When the arrest was finally made, accounts from investigators describe relief mixed with a grief-adjacent feeling that is difficult to articulate, the knowledge that the answer had been there, waiting, while the case continued. The post-conviction review of Operation Minstead was commissioned by the Metropolitan Police and examined the administrative failures in detail. It acknowledged the DNA database error. It made recommendations about record-keeping, profile loading procedures, and the quality assurance processes for major long-running investigations. Those recommendations were adopted. The residents of Southeast and Southwest London who lived through the Operation Minstead years experienced something that is worth naming explicitly, a prolonged state of fear, specifically targeting the elderly, in their own homes, that lasted nearly 2 decades without resolution. Fear of this kind has documented psychological and physical effects. Sleep disruption. Social withdrawal. Reluctance to sleep in ground-floor rooms. Heightened anxiety about home security. For an elderly population, for people in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, these effects compound existing health vulnerabilities. The community impact of Operation Minstead is not adequately captured by counting the number of directly reported offenses. Community groups in the affected areas worked throughout the investigation to raise awareness, support victims, and maintain pressure on the Metropolitan Police for results. Several of those groups have noted that the investigation received substantially less media attention than comparable cases involving younger or more demographically prominent victims, a point that connects to broader documented patterns of media coverage of crime and its victims. Here is what I keep coming back to in this case. Operation Minstead is sometimes told as a forensic triumph, and in one sense it is. The DNA work that ultimately identified Delroy Grant was rigorous, sustained, and eventually decisive. The surveillance operation that produced the arrest was professionally executed. The prosecution was thorough. But the forensic triumph framing obscures what the case actually demonstrates, that having the right evidence is not the same as using it correctly. The DNA profile that matched Grant had been collected from crime scenes years before his arrest. The database that could have matched it existed. The administrative process that should have connected them failed. The triumph, in other words, was the correction of a failure, not the absence of one. And every year between the failure and the correction was a year in which the investigation was, in effect, searching for something it already had. That is not a minor procedural footnote. It is a lesson about what large-scale forensic investigations actually require, not just the collection of evidence, but the quality assurance processes, the data management systems, and the administrative rigor to ensure that what is collected is actually used. The trial would hear all of this. But what the jury ultimately had to decide was simpler and more certain. The DNA matched. The evidence was overwhelming. and on the 24th of March 2011, they delivered their verdict. Delroy Grant stood trial at Woolwich Crown Court, a criminal court in southeast London, in early 2011. In the English legal system, serious criminal cases are heard in Crown Courts before a judge and a jury of 12 members of the public. The jury hears evidence, listens to prosecution and defense arguments, and delivers a verdict of guilty or not guilty. If guilty, the judge then determines the sentence. The prosecution case against Grant rested substantially on forensic evidence. DNA from multiple crime scenes matched his profile conclusively. Supporting evidence included the surveillance footage from the night of his arrest, witness identifications, and analysis of his movements over the period of the offending. Grant's defense maintained his innocence throughout. He did not give evidence in his own defense, which is his legal right in the English system. A defendant cannot be compelled to testify. On March 24, 2011, after deliberations, the jury found Delroy Grant guilty on all counts. He was convicted of 29 offenses including rape and burglary, representing a sample count of the full series. In sentencing, Judge Gerald Gordon described Grant's crimes as the most serious and wicked series of offenses he had encountered in his career, and sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 27 years, meaning he could not be considered for parole until he had served at least that period. Delroy Grant has, in the years since his conviction, repeatedly maintained his innocence and challenged aspects of his conviction through the English appeals process. His appeals have not succeeded. The Court of Appeal has reviewed his case and upheld the conviction. His continued denial is a matter of documented public record. It has not altered the forensic basis of the conviction, which the courts have found to be sound. The post-conviction review of Operation Minstead produced a set of recommendations that the Metropolitan Police accepted and implemented. The most significant related to the management of DNA profiles in the National DNA Database, specifically the quality assurance processes for ensuring that profiles from individuals with criminal records are correctly loaded and that searches against crime scene samples are comprehensive. The review also examined the resource allocation decisions made during the investigation's 17-year span, the periods when Operation Minstead was scaled back, when surveillance was reduced, when the case effectively lost priority within the force. These decisions were made in the context of competing demands on limited police resources, which is the operational reality of any large city force. The review acknowledged both the constraints and the consequences. The National DNA Database itself underwent significant procedural improvements in the years following the case. Cross-force data sharing, quality assurance auditing of profile loading, and the regular rerunning of historical crime scene samples against newly added profiles were strengthened. The Minstead case is now cited in British forensic training as an example of what happens when data management fails in a long-running investigation. The victims, what justice means and doesn't. For the victims of the Operation Minstead offenses, those who were alive to see the conviction, and those who had died in the intervening years, the verdict represented formal acknowledgement of what had been done to them and formal accountability for the person responsible. That is not nothing. In cases where elderly victims have waited years for justice, the formal record of a conviction matters. But several victim advocates and community representatives were explicit, after the verdict, that justice in the courtroom did not address the years of fear, the years of inadequate police response, or the years in which the administrative failure allowed the offenses to continue. The conviction did not give back what was taken. It did not compensate for the terror of sleeping in a home that had been entered without permission. It did not restore the years of safety that were lost. Those are not arguments against pursuing conviction. They are arguments for taking seriously both what the justice system can deliver and what it cannot. The answer to Operation Minstead was in a database for years before anyone found it. The forensic science worked. The administrative system around it didn't. Delroy Grant was convicted in 2011, 17 years after the first offense. The gap between those two dates is not a mystery. It is a documented set of decisions, failures, and missed connections. The lesson the case leaves behind is not about one offender's cunning. It is about what happens when institutions assume that collecting evidence is the same as acting on it. The database held the answer. The question is why nobody looked. Crime. Global true crime told like a documentary.